Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pitts. Ukraine War Frontline update for the 13th of September 2023. Let's get to a bit of news before we go to the front line. Just building on to what I talked about earlier with Sevastopol. Some people ask me why I called it Sevastopol and not Sevastopol. Just because I've listened to Ukrainians and Russians say the word and that's how it's said. You can go and check out pronunciation websites, which I did today just to check I was doing the right thing. I stumble over so many words. It's nice to get the occasional one correct. So it is Sevastopol, something along those lines. Anyway, Sevastopol. So Russian channels report that the large landing ship Minsk was destroyed irrevocably. That is bad news for the Russians. That is a ship, okay, it's not the newest of ships, but it's been geolocated to the dry dock and it has been identified by OSINT as definitely that ship. So that is a Minsk, and people saying that, you know, it's listing quite heavily there, it's been burnt and whatnot, that it is almost certainly beyond economic repair. So that is a sore loss for the Russians. I just love this. This is Anton Gerashchenko just spreading this meme almost. This is Defense Minister Shoigu being asked if Russia will win. The pause and the body language here. Okay, the video gets cut, right? So you don't know what's said next. But I think this speaks volumes.
Победим. Победим. Победим.
Just look at his face, the way he reacts, the pause, and I think that can tell you quite a lot. Right, we're going to go to the front line now, obviously. This is, we're not going to go Bakhmut to begin with, although we'll be there pretty soon because from the northeast, well, actually, first of all, we go to my map legend, so please pause the video if you want to know what all the lines on my map lines mean. Kupiansk to Svatova to Kremina front line here. This axis, there's quite a lot of activity, Novoherivka around there. Things are pretty tough, but there's no news of territorial exchanges there. It's all fairly, in fact, you can say this about most of the front line. There's not really been that many changes, even though things are pretty hot in certain places. Right, we're going to come down to Bakhmut now. To the north of Bakhmut, Andrew Perpetual on his live stream last night, very interesting, always worth watching, is saying that actually the Ukrainians are further forward in Rostelivka than he had thought previously. I think he's saying something about building some kind of wall across the road or something around this area, or the railway line. But yes, something to do with the Ukrainians being closer to the Russian positions than he had previously thought. But anyway, we're going to start really talking about Bakivka. So there's this claim like this. So Global War Monitor saying Russia has advanced near the Bakivka Reservoir and Yehidne in the Bakhmut area of Donetsk Oblast. This area was previously liberated by Ukraine. The idea that Russians have counterattacked and gained some land. Now, Andrew Perpetual has talked about this a number of times, and he has said that the whole video showing this shows the Russians taking up a position, you know, taking some land, but then, importantly, you've got to watch it to the end where they then run away. They run back and vacate the area. They are repelled. So the attack is successful up to a point, and then they're repelled, and then they go back. Now, that might have changed since then. These areas are often dynamic. Places change hands several times in a day. The idea here is that loads of people have jumped on it seems that lots of people have jumped on potentially an incorrect interpretation of a video. When we go to look at Deep State Map, the pro-Ukrainian mapper in yellow here, they are suggesting Russian gains here or a rejig, but that's probably using that data that is then interpreted by others potentially. Because when we look at like different mappers and you say, in this case, Global War Monitor, this is not a criticism of anyone, but it's maybe a criticism of us. When we look at all this data, you look at 7 different mappers, you go, well, they all agree on what just happened, so it must have happened. But you'll find that those aren't independent sources. They're all dependent sources on, for example, Deep State Map. So people might make their own versions of Deep State Map, and you just say, oh, that's 2 different sources. You might look at my map and go, and then look at Andrew Perpetua's and go, oh, look, 2 people say, well, actually, my map is dependent on Andrew Perpetua's, you know, for the blue line. At least what I'm trying to do is take 2 completely different mappers. And I'm really happy with doing this. I think it works well because you get a sense of what both sides are saying, or at least what the Russians are saying, what Andrew Perpetua in a more objective position is saying, using like also two different methods. One uses MOD statements and video evidence and whatnot, and the other uses predominantly shelling analyses of satellite imagery, which is quite objective, and other sources and whatnot too. But we must be careful when we look at like a bunch of different mappers saying, well, Ukraine have made gains here or Russia have made gains here. And you think, well, lots of people are saying it, therefore it must be true. Actually, I think an awful lot of people rely on Deep State Map and change their maps accordingly. So I think this happened with this video. That's what at least that's what Andrew Perpetua is saying here. That it's just a poor interpretation. In fact, Russians haven't advanced in the Bukivka area. Take that as you may. Right, we're going to move down to Klishchivka, further down to the south. Now, bit of a corrective here. I'm quite happy with what I have said over the course of this war. So I've been doing this, well over a year. Certainly about a year with this kind of intensity. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think I've been quite accurate. I try and think, well, where have I been completely wrong? Where have I really caught things up? And actually, do you know what? I don't think I have too much. But the other day, I don't like to speculate too much. The other day, I made a big, it's a really minor speculation. But it's like, I bet my mortgage that the Russians are not in Klishchivka. So for 2 days, I said they just won't be in Klishchivka because, my main rationale for that is because it'd be stupid to be there, right? And it turns out they are still there, right? So I'm going to correct myself, but I'm going to question what the hell they're doing there. So, okay, to the front, Bakhmut, Null Report says, 2 separate videos emerged which confirm Ukrainian presence inside Klishchivka, which we knew. The fight is still ongoing for the northeastern part. Russia reportedly brought in reserves to restore positions, and this is the key, right? My opinion is they shouldn't be there, but it appears they've sent reserves in to remain there. So the 80th Air Assault Brigade covers a house in the northeastern part of Klishchivka, which was stuffed with Russian infantry. I can't show that to you because you see them all get sort of obliterated. It confirms that Russia still has minor presence in this part of the settlement, which has been fought over for the last couple of days. Okay, so as you can see, like all the mappers agree that the Russians have been pushed right back to basically the last few houses there. That you've got high ground. We know you've got high ground just to the west of Klishchivka that the Ukrainians control. That includes very substantial fortifications and whatnot. They can take pot shots at Klishchivka. The Ukrainians have also destroyed the ground lines of communication coming into Klishchivka, and that has left the Russians with basically a couple of trails coming out to the east here, going into these windbreaks or these sort of tree lines along the side of the railway embankment. Right, so that's how they are getting in and out, and it's pretty desperate. But they're holding on to the last few houses, and they're reinforcing those houses, sending more troops in. They have this thing about as soon as they lose territory, they appear to have to regain it. It must be some kind of pride thing or PR thing, rather than being a strategically sensible thing to do or tactically sensible thing to do. And it amazes me. So I'm looking at this going, well, with my common sense approach here, like the Russians only have a couple of houses. They can't resupply this area. They can't even adequately medevac people, as we've seen injured people being taken out by their comrades being taken out by precision-guided munitions. We know that Ukrainians use precision-guided munitions in Klishchivka, right? What the hell are the Russians doing there? Just so I say, so they've left. Because surely they would have left, and there were rumours that they left. I was like, yeah, I'm speculating they're not there, but they are still there. Can you make any more sense of it than me? I don't know. I just think it's a tremendous waste. All they're doing is they are tricking their own forces. I mean, what is the point of holding on to Klishchivka? They've got a decent enough defensive line coming down south of Opitny. They've got this railway line here that would be much more sensible to defend. You might say, well, you might as well have a buffer to that defensive line, but if that entails attriting your forces. So Andrew Perpetua said that the Russians are just losing an awful lot around here. They're just losing a lot of people, equipment, I don't know. But his speculation on this is that Ukraine could take Klishchivka really easily, quite quickly. but they haven't. And he said the only thing that you can think of is that it's so attritional for the Russians here that they almost don't want to take it all. This is grinding up Russians in this northern area. And if that is at all the case, then this is just, ridiculous rationale from the Russians. And they are indeed, just throwing troops into a grinder to be ground up. Not a clever idea. So Deep State Map saying there's some Ukrainian gains to this northeastern part of Klishchiivka. And then when we come down to the south, we see Andriivka, and there are certain claims about Andriivka that just to the north of it, Ukraine have consolidated gains in the grey zone, really. Global War Monitor says Ukraine continues advancing along the road towards Andriivka. There are also claims, no report says that there's fighting inside Andriivka. So there are different claims as to what's going on. Deep State Map still has that as as Russian controlled actually, but even Surrey Maps has that as grey zone. I've said that surely the Ukrainians will be in it and basically controlling it pretty much now. But sometimes these small places can take an awful long time to clear out. Anyway. So that's Andriivka, and there's quite a lot of footage going around. I won't really show you this. I'll show a few sort of stills from it. As Konstantin says here, who is on Andrew Pepecha's live stream, actually, the battlefield around Bakhmut is littered with the Russian invaders' bodies. Death looms in every tree line and windbreak, but they choose as fate themselves. Lust for conquest and a desire to rule others results in nothing but suffering. It's hell on earth. So anyway. What I just want to show you is that you have, by the side of these railways, these dugouts that the Ukrainians are absolutely hammering with IEDs dropped from these drones. As you can see, the result of these IEDs, multiple burn marks, explosions that are, causing quite a lot of trouble for the Russians in the dugouts there, a lot of smoke. It's just really tough. Along these railway lines, you can see those railway lines there, so on and so forth. Right, so that is basically these railway lines going up from Kurdyamivka up past Andriivka to Klishchiivka, and to the east of them particularly, to the east of the railway lines, there are these dugouts in the tree lines, and that's what you were just seeing getting hit by IEDs. You can bet your bottom dollar that the Ukrainians are consistently hammering these tree lines and making life for the Russians there particularly difficult. I haven't heard anything about the interdiction of this railway line and the Ukrainians moving across possibly to the east of it here, south of Andriivka and north of Kurdyamivka. But I'm sure information will come through eventually. Now we're going to go to Opitny. Right. Lots of claims about Opitny. As you can see, Russian gains. I don't know that this is a counterattack as much as it is overzealous mappers, including myself, or OSINT people, making claims about Opitny. Now, to be honest, I was just reporting what others said, and I gave you the full range. In fact, I think it was Opitny I was talking about, where I said, you've got the full range of accounts of what is going on here. There were these claims that there was a big lightning counterattack, which I think there was. There was a Ukrainian attack around here. The question is how far that attack got. Andrew Pepecha spent quite a lot of time on his live stream talking about this last night. We'll join the end of what he was saying here.
Both a bit now, I guess. Anyways, so
this is his conclusion.
Kind of the situation in Opitny. I think people were really wildly misinterpreting what was happening, because what Ukraine did was a really big achievement in that they basically broke all of the lines of defense in front of Opitny. But
just to give you some context there, all these lines of defense in front of Opitny are these tree lines that are heavily fortified and take one heck of a lot of effort to overcome, to break, and to take. And that in itself is a huge achievement, is what he's saying. But that achievement might have been kind of overzealously shouted about by pro-Ukrainians particularly. Although there were Russians saying this, there were also Russian sources saying retreating towards the airport. So I'm not 100% sure that Perpetua's dismissal of what happened in Opitny is definitely true. Like, although the mappers are pushing back Russian lines here, but that could be counterattacks. I don't have enough information, or it could just be rejigging lines because people were a bit too overconfident.
People interpreted that as Ukraine capturing Opitna, and I see no evidence of that.
He basically sees no evidence of that. However, and he talked previously, I didn't play you the whole bit, but he talks previously as there's no evidence of this. This were the people in the OSINT community saying X, Y, and Z. But actually, it wasn't just that. And this is where I'm going to put a question mark in, because we explicitly had the Deputy Defence Minister, Hannah Malia, claiming that they were fighting in the north of the settlement, right? And so it's not quite that they were just fighting here, and that got interpreted as there were claims that they were fighting in the north of the settlement, and the Ukrainians had control of the north of the settlement. So this is the ISW yesterday. Ukrainian forces conducted offensive operations along the Avdiivka-Donetsk city line, but did not make any confirmed advances yesterday. Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister Hannah Malia confirmed that Ukrainian forces entered Opitny, and that fighting is ongoing in the settlement. And that's what she said, and that's footnoted, and I reported that. A Russian mill blogger claimed that Russian forces control Opitny and fighting is ongoing north of the settlement, where Ukrainian forces control unspecified positions. That would be those tree lines we've just been talking about. The Russian MOD claimed that Russian forces repelled Ukrainian attacks near Avdiivka, so that you assume it could be here, right? So again, you've got the whole range of claims going on, like the maximalist claims for the Ukrainians that they're fighting towards the airport, but that was also confirmed by Russian mill bloggers as well. And when you have enemy attestation, so when you have, like in this case, the Russians claiming that the Ukrainians have done well in certain areas, you give that more credence and say when the Ukrainians might claim that, and vice versa, because actually it's admitting something bad, and therefore it's more likely to be true, rather than shouting about you having done something amazing, right? So it's just, there's a lot of confusion here as to exactly what's going on. That actually should be in red, Russian gains there. Yeah, it might look like that's gains, but it might not. It might be actually not losses rather than actual gains, but it could be a counterattack as well. What I guess we'll see in the next few days. I mean, this is a really important area because, as I mentioned yesterday, you could do a pincer movement, cut off Vodjane, get back to the annexation lines, and also take on the airport there, which has quite a lot of historical significance, but also you're getting very close to Donetsk as well. And as Perpetua was saying, there were some claims that they're fighting the airport, getting onto the outskirts of Donetsk, and of course, I never said that, but there were some out there who were. So take everything with a pinch of salt, and assume that it could just as well not be true, or that when there are gains, there could be counterattacks fairly soon after. And we know that the Russians, as I say, don't like to, for whatever reason, whether it's PR reasons, pride, or whatever, they don't like to lose ground. So they'll do a counterattack straight away afterwards. And that's what we see in a whole number of cases along the front line quite consistently. Anyway, so that is Opitny. Now, we're going to go to Novomayorsky next, which is here. And Andrew Perpetua, again, slightly sort of controversially, well, not controversially, but if you're like overtly pro-Ukrainian, you'll be like, dang, a bit like Opitny. So he's saying that this attack on Novomayorsky seems to have all the hallmarks of a failed Ukrainian attack, like a repelled attack. Like they've got this far and then they've had to pull back. So it could be that Novodonetsk, and I was saying yesterday that they are only doing these attacks. These are small scale attacks. I said very, very explicitly they're using, one company of troops or two company or whatever, just really small, or platoon even, the initial attacks on Novomayorsky. So this is not a large scale attack. And quite often you do these probing attacks, you get as far as you can until you meet like large-scale resistance, and then you pull back. So it could well be that Novomyorsk was that. There seems to be a bit more success going to the south of and southwest of Novodonetsk. I don't know. We'll see how that turns out. But Andrew Perpetua wasn't sure about that, but he just said it's got the hallmarks of that. There's not too much information coming out from that kind of area. I mean, when you look at the ISW, it's the same sort of thing that we're used to seeing, which is Russian sources claim that Russian forces repelled attacks in Novomyorsk, Priyutne, Urizhny, Staromyorsk. So all around here, they're claiming they are repelling counterattacks, and that could well be true. Probably is true, because there's no obvious movement along those lines. And that goes across this whole salient. And I really do think actually the Ukrainians have just sat back and they're probably we already talked about how they're refitting. They're going to be reconstituting their forces here as they did some quite major attacks to get through down to Urizhny, and then they kind of stopped. And I don't know whether they're now just content on sitting back and letting their artillery just do some attritional work and really degrading the Russian artillery, counter-battery capabilities, as well as air defense and whatnot. So and supplies. So there are some claims from some Russians that the whole front might be close to collapsing because of lack of supplies, and things are really difficult. And we've heard anecdotal evidence from captured Russian POWs that suggest that hey, they're getting no food, they have to steal everything, etc., etc. And so that might be the case, that the Ukrainians are thinking, well, rather than waste our troops fighting really hard over these positions, let's just let HIMARS and artillery do what we've got them to do. And it may take, as I said yesterday, it may take weeks and weeks. It takes as long as it takes before the Ukrainians will be ready to strike. Stretch, starve, strike. Strike comes when they're ready. Okay, so going on to look at Zaporizhia going westwards, Russian propagandist from War Gonzo says, according to reports from sources on the ground, the enemy is not abandoning attempts to reach Novopokrovivka, and in recent days has become more active west of the village of Robotina, trying to advance towards Kopani through the windbreaks. Okay, let's try and make sense of that. So here's Robotina, not too much to be heard about this. The Ukrainian General Staff has said that the Ukrainians have made 300 to 500 meters gains, so they are making gains in this area. It's all very attritional, and it's no doubt costing the Ukrainians. It also appears to be costing the Russians an awful lot too, as we'll go on to get a sense of. But this is the idea that the Ukrainians are trying, and I talked about this yesterday, trying to widen their salient so that they can more safely supply their troops on the front line. You just need a nice wide salient, and they're working hard to the east of Kopani, moving westwards towards that settlement. And that's what Wargonzo is saying there. No report says geolocated footage shows that the Ukrainians have advanced slightly closer to Verbove. Russian sources claim that Ukrainians have become active west of Robotny towards Kopani, but he says no evidence of that yet. So that's going on Wargonzo's claims. But yeah, here there seems to be, as you can see, Surat maps emit some gains for the the Ukrainians here. There seems to be some gain for the Ukrainians, in the western Verbove area and along these sort of trench lines and whatnot. So if we now look at some geo-confirmation, let's try and see if we can place some of the Ukrainian troops. The Ukrainians are clearing the trenches, covering the Surovikin line behind the breach, slowly expanding the cleared area near Verbove. And there's lots of work by GeoConfirm, which is a really good source. Over a length of 8 kilometers, the Surovikin line is now in direct fire range, even when with tanks near Novopokrovivka. So we've seen that. Footage of advancement in trenches. So this would assume that one would assume that these are Ukrainians advancing in the trench lines, and that would be, very close to Verbove. So yeah, that would signify, that's the edge of the Russian controlled area as according to Surat map. So I would say Andrew Perpetua's claims that the Russians have pushed back to there are more accurate given that geolocation. We'll try and plug in a few more, some more geolocations. This is the the Russians shelling Ukrainians. So again, this is Ukrainians in the trench line here. And we'll see where that is on my map. Do like a bit of geolocation. Where's it going to send me? Where's it going to send me? Here, again, almost exactly the same place. So that might be the same kind of maneuver there. And then we'll move on to the next one. Oops, sorry, wrong source there. Footage of Ukrainians closing in on the Surovikin line in another location. Okay, so Ukrainians closing in on trench lines. I think there's any others. Yeah, and that goes on to the Novopokrovka tanks that we talked about over the last couple of days. So the last geolocation for Ukrainians is actually right down here. So that fits in with what all the mappers are basically saying. So Ukrainians gaining in this area too. That's where they had some success over the last sort of 48 hours going south. And that's to the east of Novopokrovka, and it goes on to geolocate the tank activity around there that we talked about over the last couple of days. So that suggests that the Ukrainians are indeed making these advances that the general staff are claiming, and others are too. And this is Wargonzo talking about situation in Novopokrovka. Actually, that's going back 2 days. No, it's going back to yesterday. So in the Zaporizhia direction, the Ukrainian armed forces, with the support of artillery, reached Novopokrovka and attacked in a forest plantation 1.5 kilometers north of the village. So, okay, so I just want to say 1.5 kilometers north of Novopokrovka, depends where you're taking that from. But if you're taking that straight from there, then you're going to be somewhere around this forest. Now, there are differing claims about what's going on up here, whether the Russians still control some of the trench lines that were previously thought to be under Ukrainian control. So I think there could well be some fighting still going on between Novopokrovka and Robotyne. And it's probably why the Ukrainians are trying to come in from the east now, because it could be an easier route. I actually said that about a week ago, to be honest. Okay, I don't think there was anything else from no reports. New forward positions, and that's what I've just shown you on the other, on the other geolocation. So this is a Russian source on Verbove. The front has every chance of collapsing. So this is what they're referring to earlier, because supply routes are under threat of fire control. In the Verbove area, says the Russian source, the crest has already, so the Ukrainians have already reached the Dragon's Teeth of General Zemlyanikin. The road to Tokmak is just a stone's throw away. The supply of a number of units is under threat of fire control. The Ukrainian can advance simply by throwing more and more waves of infantry into battle, but the tactic works. Without decisive counterattacks, the defense in this sector has every chance of collapsing. The situation is critical. So that is calling the alarm bells for the Russians. Now here we have the situation where you have these defenses, you have Russian forces, and in the absence of A-10s being able to blitz this whole area and drop bombs and clear out those trenches from the air, without that kind of air superiority and capability, the Ukrainians eventually, once they've attrited enough artillery and air defense systems or whatever, mainly artillery and mortars and whatnot, once they've done that attrition, they have to take the trenches, and you have to use humans to do that. And obviously equipment too, mechanized equipment. So in doing so, they are going to be losing troops. And the Russian source talks about the Ukrainians using waves of soldiers to do this, and it might be at quite a high cost for the Ukrainians. But it's one of those things that if you want that territory, then you've got to take it, and eventually you're going to take it like that. So, but the Russians are there at least saying it, but it is working. And then you see footage like this, which I presume is Ukrainian as a result of Ukrainian fire. This is in the Verbove Novopokrovka area. I don't really know exactly where it's referring to and whether it is definitely Ukrainian. I'm just kind of joining the dots here, but yeah, things are tough. There's a really, really good interview of Leopard 2 trained tank crew, and I think I put that one on the Discord server, so you can go and check that out. Link below. They were talking about how great the Leopard is compared to the old Soviet tanks it used to drive and operate, but They were saying that they operate at night and at dawn. That's when they use their Leopard 2s. Because they have that advantage, so you can assume that a lot of activity is taking place at night for the Russians, for the Ukrainians, because there's an asymmetry in equipment there, and although the Russians will have some night vision capabilities, I think the Ukrainians, certainly with their Western equipment, do have the advantage there. Kenneth Gregg, Finnish fighters in Ukraine, not fighting, but he's there at the moment, says, early morning update, the Russians have now moved everything they have into a V formation at the Zaporizhia front. They want to counter us before the main line and are deploying everything they have, all caps. We have cruel losses on both sides right now, so yeah, it is costing the Ukrainians almost necessarily. But the battle for Zaporizhia and Kherson Oblast will be decided here and now. This is exactly what I've been saying the last couple of days, that this is where it's at. This particular Robotyne sector, you have the best Russian troops, the best Ukrainian troops, the highest density of minefields, the highest density of fortifications and trenches. So, if the Russians manage to keep us pinned down until winter, they have achieved a defensive victory. If we manage to break through now, we have a very successful winter and can, in principle, liberate the entire Kherson Oblast and Zaporizhia. The next 2 weeks will decide. I absolutely agree. I think the next 2 weeks are crucial for what is taking place here. Not really heard too much else, not much about Luhove and Piatycheki area. So I think it is, in some senses, quiet. I get this. I still have the understanding that Ukrainians are probably just happy, scare quotes, happy, to attrit from a distance Russian forces and not overcommit their own forces to preserve them. But yes, if we come down to Kherson and the Dnipro River, this is actually, and I don't know, JR has done this, and I guess this means we might have missed this one from the 8th of September. But this is the Ukrainians having a new bridgehead on the left bank of the Dnipro River as it comes down in this direction. So the left is on the right-hand side. Hey, nice. So on the left bank over here, and we already know that we understand that the Ukrainians have a couple of bridgeheads to the southwest of the Antonivsky Bridge, or actually at the Antonivsky Bridge, and then further down on the left bank here. So there are multiple now areas where the Ukrainians can attack from, and I was talking about this last week about how you want as many positions along here as possible to keep the Russians guessing. It's a bit like whack-a-mole. You don't know where you're going to attack, and then you can choose any one of them and exploit any weaknesses there. Right, the last thing I'm going to say that I find is pretty interesting. Ukraine has control over Pervomaisky Island in Mykolaiv Oblast, near the Kimburn Spit. It's unclear when this happens, says Global War Monitor. Now, where is this island? Remember, the Kimburn Peninsula here is a place where it's quite difficult to move along. It's a nature reserve, a national park, and we have the Kimburn Spit at the end of the peninsula. This has been a place where the Russians have been attacking Ochakiv, where there are sort of marine training bases and whatnot, with their artillery, and then the Ukrainians are trying to hammer them with counter-battery fire. So the Ukrainians have been, I think, constraining the Russian artillery in this area, but it appears that this island just here is now under the control of the Ukrainians, which I think is significant. It's a bit of a double-edged sword. So having control of that island means that the Russians can easily hammer you with all sorts of artillery. I mean, it's a small island, and if they know you're there, you're in a bit of trouble. Where that's like 18 kilometers, give or take, from the middle of the peninsula, one would assume that the Russians can easily hit that with their artillery. But it could well be a very useful stepping stone to taking some positions on the Kimburn Spit. I would assume that if they have control of that, then maybe the artillery and Russian positions on the Kimburn Spit have been compromised. But I don't know. I just think that's an interesting development there, and good for the Ukrainians. Okay, so that's really all there is today. Not a massive amount of news. Just trying to clarify a few maybe misconceptions. and to get a bit more detail for some of these hotspots. Please like, subscribe, and share. Really appreciate your support. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.